For the last handful of videos in my first time reading Bleach, the story has kept me mostly focused on what's going on in the living world, in the construct of Karakura Town, where the battle against Aizen's Arancars has been raging. We've had Soul Reapers protecting pillars, Yamamoto being an absolute tank on the battlefield, and Espada's finally showing me their tattoos. It's been a crazy ride over here, but while all of this has been going on, the main character of Bleach, along with most of the primary supporting cast, have all been stuck in a whole other dimension. We can't forget that despite Aizen's big plan with the Oken and the Soul King and all of that, the primary driving force in the narrative has been Ichigo trying to get Orihime back from Hueco Mundo. And he's still over there, still fighting to bring her home. And unfortunately for him, Aizen left Ulquiorra in charge of the Hollow's homeland, where he has become the main obstacle between Ichigo and Orihime. This clash was inevitable, especially after their previous encounter, and boy, did Kubo deliver. We are given what may be the best confrontation in all of Bleach so far, if not only from a fight choreography standpoint, then from a sheer intensity and escalation standpoint that's infused with clashing philosophies, unexpected transformations, and a surprisingly touching end to one of our most iconic antagonists. But first, we have to talk about the build-up and what's going on around this fight, just so I can give my brief thoughts before we dive headfirst into the main event. On his way to rescue Orihime, Ichigo was initially intercepted by a bunch of huge hollows and my favorite janitors, and it turns out there's more to these custodians than it seems. Thankfully, Rukia, Chad, and Renji are there to help support him and give him a chance to go straight to Orihime. It's awesome to have them show up to back him up, and leads to Rukia facing the leader of the janitors, and as it turns out, this guy, Rudborn, is actually the only member of this supposed group. He has this cool ability where he can essentially just grow new minions who are part of him because he's like a tree and his minions are like his fruit. It's a fun little twist that I didn't expect and that I really love, because Kubo didn't need to do that for a character like this, but I'm so glad he did. It's just inventive and fun and a little extra problem to deal with. But that's not what we're here to talk about. No, we are on to the real fight. Ichigo makes it to the throne room to try to get Orihime back and finds Ulquiorra standing between them. And I love that Ulquiorra has no intention of killing her, but every intention of killing Ichigo. He recognizes him as a real threat, which is a nice subtle acknowledgement considering when they first met, Ulquiorra didn't think that Ichigo was a problem even worth worrying about. I also love that Ulquiorra drew his sword this time, and the duel begins. And this might have usurped Grimmjow vs. Ichigo round 3 as my favorite fight in the series. It's at least a close call. While that fight did such a spectacular job of building up hype between rivals, showing a ferocious battle between two very similar people, this fight with Ulquiorra felt a bit deeper, a bit darker, and a bit richer thematically, and at times, the scope of it felt epic and kind of mythic. Ichigo and Grimmjow's tension came from being rivals that kind of hated seeing parts of themselves reflected back at one another. There was disdain, a little bit of respect, and a desire to prove themselves stronger than the other. They fought multiple times, each at least damaging the other each time in a series of bouts, whereas Ulquiorra and Ichigo don't have that same dynamic. They haven't had multiple rounds of actual skirmishes. The only real encounter they had before this was super brief and just served to show how much stronger Ulquiorra was. And he really was, considering he killed Ichigo with very little effort at all. Ulquiorra isn't a rival like Grimmjow was. He's not putting missions at risk just to try to prove that he's stronger. No, Ulquiorra is just a wall, in Ichigo's way. It's much more of an even duel than last time, where Ichigo isn't getting taken out immediately again, and the question is raised of why he's gotten so much stronger, whether it's from his fight with Grimmjow or his desire to protect Orihime and his friends, and I think it's a mixture of all of it. We saw against Grimmjow how Ichigo's strength can increase based on his determination to protect his loved ones. His reason for fighting, his purpose for living, is what gives him strength. And it's in all of this conversation that an interesting philosophical idea comes about that really got me thinking, and that feels like kind of the backbone of a lot of this. Is Ichigo becoming more of a hollow, or is Ulquiorra becoming more human? This right here, this is fascinating, and the epitome of what this entire Arrancar arc has really been about at its core. On one hand, we have what's been happening with Ichigo and the Vizard's holification granting Soul Reapers hollow masks, and on the other hand, we've got Arrancars who by their nature are becoming more like Soul Reapers, or to go even further, kind of ripping off the masks to show more of the humanity that they lost when they became hollows. It's a really interesting thing that this whole storyline is kind of revolved around, really. Both sides of the spectrum are kind of pulling each other towards the other. What's happening between is where these characters are kind of falling. And I absolutely love that this idea really comes to the forefront in this fight in particular, and in a massive way. When Ichigo holifies and uses his mask, it does give him an edge for a second, but Ulquiorra goes up through the fake sky and the ceiling above Las Noches to be able to transform. Because it turns out that the top 4 Espada aren't able to use their most powerful Ceros or use their Resurrections while within Las Noches. That right there shows just how much Aizen doesn't actually trust the Espada and always feels the need to be in absolute control. Just them being in their headquarters is limiting their power. But once we reach the top, Ulquiorra transforms for the first time. And I was so excited to see what his resurrection would be like, and we finally have it. I loved the atmosphere with the black rain falling in the white desert, with Ulquiorra growing these large black wings. His transformation looks like some sort of fallen angel or something. There's this one panel in particular that really has this like biblical feeling with Ichigo bowing to some angel, when in actuality, he's about to stand up and refuse to stay down because it's Ichigo. It's great stuff. The actual design of the transformation itself is a little underwhelming to me, but maybe Kubo wanted it to be that way so he could save the better design for the surprise, as Ulquiorra reveals that he has a second stage of his transformation. I had so many questions on my mind while seeing this. He claims to be the only Espada to achieve it, and hasn't shown Aizen. But why hasn't he? Of the Espada, Ulquiorra has seemed to be the one most loyal and the most trusted by Aizen, so I'm a little surprised that he wouldn't show him this. But then again, given what we learn about Ulquiorra, maybe it wasn't as simple as being loyal to Aizen. Maybe there was always part of him that didn't even want to bother with Aizen's greater plans. But let's say he did show him this second transformation. Would revealing this raise his rank within the Espada? Would he shoot up to the number 1 potentially? It's hard to say since we haven't seen the top 3's resurrections yet, and maybe some of them have these second stage transformations too, and Ulquiorra just doesn't know it. I don't know, but it's interesting to consider. Whatever the case, this is a massive upgrade power-wise and design-wise too. Before, he looked mainly kind of just like Ulquiorra with a full helmet and wings. Now he becomes something much more demonic looking, and the word to activate the resurrection is apparently bat in Spanish, which makes a lot of sense given the design and the more animalistic qualities of the Espada transformations. I love it. Just like with so many of these resurrections, the design reflects that this is more of who and what Ulquiorra really is deep down, him at his most pure, and it's scary just how much more powerful he becomes this way. Like, the whole point of him showing this transformation is to just show Ichigo how hopeless things are, and he makes that very apparent very quickly, because I had a lot of expectations for the inevitable Ulquiorra and Ichigo rematch, and it was fulfilling those expectations in a lot of ways. Ichigo being able to face Ulquiorra more evenly? Check. Ulquiorra showing his resurrection? Check. Ulquiorra making another hole in Ichigo's chest? Wait, what? This was a really shocking moment, but so effective. It reiterated for us that no matter how much stronger Ichigo's gotten since last time, he's still not enough on his own yet. The final result will still be the same. He will lose to Ulquiorra, he will wind up with a massive hole in his chest, but really Ulquiorra has got to knock this MO off. I know it's apparently his thing to like recreate his own hollow hole. He also made sure to do this right in front of Orihime, which... yikes. And it led into these absolutely crazy pages that serve as something of a midpoint in this battle. And it was rough. It's hard to see Orihime have an absolute breakdown seeing Ichigo like that and not being able to help him. She's discovered these powers that can literally like undo reality and physical phenomenons, but according to Ulquiorra, she still wasn't strong enough to actually save him from the damage that he inflicted. It's just an extremely intense sequence as we're kind of taken on Orihime's mental journey as the panic and the helplessness and the despair really sets in. She's just too devastated seeing Ichigo in that state, and it's not helping that Uryu is getting literally ripped apart by Ulquiorra at the same time right next to her. She may have come to terms with her friends wanting to put themselves in harm's way to save her, but it's different thinking about that compared to seeing them get killed or horribly injured in front of her eyes, where she's not able to help. Because in her position, how can you not blame yourself? They're only there to help her, and now Ichigo looks dead and Uryu's on his way there, and despite all of the power she's attained, it might not be able to fix this. Orihime's breakdown was such an unabashedly human moment for the character, and I loved it because this is how many people would react under these kinds of horrible circumstances. She just watched the man she loves apparently die while trying to save her, and this is the second time she's seen this happen, and now another friend could be killed too. It's just a horrifying situation to be in. As much as everyone would want to be heroic, or maybe vengeful, or be able to do anything, I respect that Kubo just let one of his heroes fall apart and give in to despair a little, because the situation is just that bad. She's not used to this. Orihime was just a regular teenage girl until fairly recently, and now she's in another horrible dimension where she has been kidnapped, threatened, mentally assaulted, physically assaulted, forced to do things she didn't want to do. It's just been awful, and now this is happening, and I feel for her. This is absolutely horrible, and it's a hard scene to read, and it's hard to see her break down like this, but I can't blame her. I'd be out of my mind too. I'd be in a fetal position on the floor. I don't know. Like, I just appreciate that we allowed one of our heroes to have a moment like this, where everything she's been through kind of comes crashing down on her at once. That is human. That's what I like about Orihime as a character. Loved it. Human beings can break down sometimes. That's just how it is. Anyway, and I really loved how Uryu is absolutely angry at what happened to Ichigo. He's not crumbling the same way that Orihime is, but he's so determined to avenge his friend, continuing to throw himself at Ulquiorra over and over. He even loses an arm in the attempts. He may be a Quincy and may not technically supposed to even be working with a Soul Reaper, but it's clear how much Uryu cares about his friendship with Ichigo, and he's willing to just get ripped apart to avenge him. And it's only when Orihime is at her lowest point, completely shattering and begging for help, that Ichigo comes back to try to protect her, but he isn't exactly himself, because that's when Ichigo transforms into something we've never really seen before. We've seen him utilize his hollow mask, obviously, and during his training with the Visored when he was initially gaining control of his hollow side, we saw him almost be completely overtaken by his hollow side, but now we're seeing a fully realized version of that, it seems like, and it is legitimately so frightening and alarming, especially when one of the first things he does is casually rip off Ulquiorra's arm with ease. It's just really uncomfortable seeing Ichigo this way because, well, it isn't really Ichigo, but it also kind of is. And it's this weird dichotomy of that, where it feels monstrous and scary and not like our boy, but it's coming from a place that absolutely is Ichigo. Ulquiorra asks the haunting question of who are you? And the answer to me is pretty clear. The white doppelganger inside of Ichigo's mind, the hollow version of Zangetsu, of Ichigo, has apparently taken the steering wheel and fully taken over in the moment. We used to have to see Ichigo deal with its encroaching influence and control, but he managed to learn how to keep it in check and be the one wearing the mask instead of the mask wearing him. But when it comes down to it, the all-white Ichigo in his mind and this rabid beast are both still Ichigo. They're all Ichigo. They're different aspects of him, perhaps, but they are still coming from the same place. This hollow version of him is following Ichigo's innate desire to protect his friends. That's what he's doing even then, or he's at least trying to, but the hollow is violent, brutal, and seems to be acting purely on instinct and the desire to protect Orihime, but it's warped. There's no humanity to it, but it's still coming from a very human place, if that makes sense. And this was always hinted at and foreshadowed as a possibility when we were learning about holification, and seeing it come to pass is very scary, but very fulfilling from a narrative point, and I really love this design. It feels like the natural endpoint of what we see with the mask and when Ichigo is nearly taken over before. From the outside, there's so little visible Ichigo at all. It's more of this rabid force of nature. It suddenly isn't about two warriors anymore. It's about two monsters for a bit, and it's just as ferocious as can be expected between two opponents like this. And this hollified Ichigo doesn't hold back. He just absolutely crushes Ulquiorra and is not going to stop, even to the point that Uryu tries to intervene, only to get stabbed. And when they finally do break through, and Ichigo returns to normal, the hole in his chest heals on its own, which is definitely interesting. But there's a part of it that I loved in all of this aftermath, where he's not happy with the damage he's been able to inflict on Ulquiorra. He's not happy about seemingly being on the verge of victory. He doesn't like that he wasn't the one to win. He doesn't want to win that way, but instead has to deal with the fact that it was his hollow side that managed to actually put up a fight and beat Ulquiorra down. And while I fully believe this beast is a part of Ichigo rather than an entirely separate entity, I can understand why he wouldn't want to acknowledge that the power that took over wasn't his own, that it wasn't the real him. It's hard to accept that something as ferocious as this, as dark as this, something that he only sees the devastating aftermath of, came from a part of his own being. He doesn't feel he deserved to win because he doesn't see it as being done with his own merits, but from what I can tell, this is still him, so this is still his win. I get him not wanting to see it that way, but from where I'm sitting on the outside, it's clear that the inner hollow is a part of Ichigo, just like the more traditional Zangetsu is, which means that this power belonged to him, and yes, he hurt a friend. Yes, he fought in a way that he probably wouldn't have fought before, but it all came from somewhere inside of him, something scary that he has to deal with, and I think that brings a lot of good drama to the character. And Ulquiorra is just like literally on his last leg after dealing with the hollow Ichigo. Like, he's not okay. Like, he can regenerate, but he's been beaten to a point where his insides aren't coming back. So let's talk about his end, his very melancholic, beautiful ending. Because while Ulquiorra has always stood out, it becomes very clear in these chapters that he's one of the most complex characters in Bleach so far. The big thing here is that Ulquiorra has trouble believing that human emotions, human connections, the aspects that make people who they are, caring for others, loving others, he doesn't believe any of that can really exist because he can't see any of it with his own eyes. And there's something to the idea of Ulquiorra and eyes, whether it's his design kind of always highlighting them in general with the lines that are even more emphasized after his transformation, or the fact that his resurrection is clearly related to bats, creatures that have limited vision through their eyes. Hell, one of the first things we ever saw Ulquiorra do was pluck out an eye and show people what he saw with it. And what he saw might not have been the truth in the end, given how everything has turned out. Like, he believed back then from watching Ichigo in his scouting mission that Ichigo wouldn't be a problem, and clearly that wasn't how things turned out. So there's something beautiful about Ulquiorra and eyes, and it may not be as blatant as, say, my boy Zamari and eyes. I really loved this thematically, this through line for his character throughout all of this. And I was very happy to see that the emphasis on Ulquiorra's eyes was carried over in his backstory that Kubo released years later. So let's touch on that, because I had a chorus of you guys and my friend who helps guide me through the series all saying that it might be beneficial for me to read the Ulquiorra backstory that came long after these chapters to help me get more of a complete picture of his character. I honestly hesitated with this idea at first because part of me wanted to experience all of Bleach the same way that readers did initially, but Kubo created the supplemental material for a reason, and most of the people that read Bleach without this backstory back then did so because this backstory wasn't attainable, since Kubo hadn't told it yet. So I figured, why not, especially with how many people were recommending it. So I read the chapters, and then I read this fairly recently, like last night when I was working on this video, just to get an idea of what people were talking about and a little bit more about Ulquiorra after his death. So let's get into it a little, and let's treat it like it's Ulquiorra's life flashing before his eyes before we say goodbye to his character. While this was a very brief little story Kubo showed, it was very worth telling, especially with how much it kind of enhanced and just reinforced what Ulquiorra has given us within Bleach. Getting a glimpse of his past puts him in a spotlight that he hasn't truly been given before, which gives Kubo the perfect chance to emphasize aspects of the character while showing us some new things too. I loved the look of his pre-Arrancar design and the full mask. It still was very much Ulquiorra without seeing the actual face we're so familiar with, but it was the chance to have a few extra pages to get inside of his head that I really enjoy. It was also interesting to learn how different he felt from his fellow Hollows. I'm not sure how literal some of this is, or if some of it is more just interpretation, but either way, it's clear that he didn't share the hunger that most Hollows inherently have and felt like an outcast among all of his peers. He didn't have a mouth when he was a Hollow. Most Hollows we've seen are all about chomping down on things, and Ulquiorra couldn't do that. He could just watch. And we see that Ulquiorra naturally broke his mask, being transformed on his own into an Arrancar without Aizen and the Hogyaku. This is interesting because it shows his loyalty to Aizen hasn't been because he owed him for breaking his mask or anything like that. I do wonder though, looking back, how many of the Espada were already naturally Arrancars and how many needed Aizen's help. But Ulquiorra's mask shattering gave him an opportunity for a different kind of existence, but unfortunately his worldview was already so set and so limited that it only started to change at the very end. It's always been pretty evident that Ulquiorra is nihilistic, and these pages literally spell that out for us. He's lived such a strange, isolated existence, completely numb to emotion and feeling, and again, only trusting his eyes, because for a while that was all he really had. His backstory just makes it clear how much he's focused on nothingness and actual emptiness, and how he views existence as a whole. The first impression Kubo gave me of him as a character was when Ulquiorra was just referring to everyone as trash. But it wasn't because he looked down on people like I originally thought. It was because he regarded everything that way, even himself. He wasn't the trash man that I thought he was, picking up, garbage cans. He was right there among the rest of us in the garbage heap, as far as he was concerned. And there are multiple times when he told Ichigo to just finish him, to end his existence, but when his real end came, while he accepted it, there was a moment of longing, a flicker of hope in the middle of all of the despair, where he seemed like he might have wanted to see more with those eyes of his. Everything that Ulquiorra experiences, he experiences based solely on what is visible or tangible. Things like the bonds between people, which Kubo has established in the narrative before as the heart, are things that are too foreign to Ulquiorra. And it's just fantastic to kind of return to the idea of hearts that was first really emphasized by Kai and Terukia, the bond that connects people to one another, that they carry for one another, something that Ulquiorra doesn't believe in, because again, he can't understand the abstract, the feeling of the heart, and instead is just trying to logically figure it out because he can't see it and he can't hold it. In some ways, Ulquiorra is kind of the hollow. He's empty, full of nothing, and while he may not have been obsessed with devouring souls like others, in actuality, he still hungered for something in the end, something to finally fulfill him. What makes him interesting is that despite kind of personifying the nature of a hollow, he has slowly become interested in humanity, unknowingly developing complicated feelings about Orihime and Ichigo, and not even noticing the small changes happening to himself as he starts to become, in some ways, more human. The interactions between Orihime and Ulquiorra throughout this whole arc have been absolutely fascinating. Some of my favorite little conversations. He was the first one that took note of her abilities, the one that came to collect her by threatening her friends, and the one that kept watch over her when she was a prisoner, often visiting her cell, wondering how she hadn't given in to hopelessness, wondering how she could still believe in her friends who were doomed to die, and just observing her. Again, Ulquiorra and his eyes. To me, their relationship has been slowly building up on a simple premise. Ulquiorra wants to understand her. He wants to understand humanity. And in his final moments, Ulquiorra can finally see the things that he couldn't before, if only a little bit. Thanks to the actions of Ichigo and Orihime, for a small moment, he can see the bonds. He can almost hold the heart in his hand. It's a beautiful end for a great character. And I'm really gonna miss Ulquiorra. He's been such an interesting presence since his introduction, and easily one of the most fascinating characters in the whole series, and one that is honestly one of the first faces to come to mind now when I think of Bleach. I'm glad he got to go out like this, defeated in one of the series' best fights, a fight that also showed us so much about his character. And that was part of what made these chapters so good, that made this battle so good. It showed us different layers to the two combatants, not just in their development as warriors or their growth in power, but also seeing different sides to them as they straddled the line between humanity and hollows. This absolute brawl brought us an Ichigo that was becoming much more like a hollow, and a hollow that, if only for a fleeting moment, was becoming much more human. It was fantastic, absolutely amazing. This whole fight, so many of its moments, and definitely its conclusion, was breathtaking and an absolute roller coaster. And like I said, it's easily one of the best fights in the series so far, and it's gonna be a hard one to top, I think. Like, this one had pretty much everything I wanted. Yeah, these chapters were phenomenal. This fight was crazy, and I love everything that it brought to the story. And you may be wondering, why haven't you talked about Yami? And that's a fair question, because I've been wondering where he is, and we found out where he is, but the truth is, I think getting into all of that too in this video would take away the focus of what I really want to dive into in this. This video is about Ichigo, Ulquiorra, and Orihime, but I do have a lot of thoughts on what we see of Yami right here, which I'm gonna have to talk about next time, because the chapter after this fight did something with Yami that, well, what? We'll talk about that next time. For now, thanks so much for watching as always. Take care. See you guys later. Bye-bye.